queen's body is not supposed to swell like bread dough left too long by the fire. Nobody warns you about that when you first go into royal service. They tell you about the gold thread and the velvet and the way the whole court bends at the waist when she enters a room. But nobody tells you that one day you will kneel at her feet with your sleeves rolled to the elbow, unwrapping linen bandages stiff with dried fluid, and that the leg underneath will be so distended the skin has split in 3 places, weeping through the cloth. Nobody tells you that greatness, up close, smells like a wound that will not close. You know this because your hands have done it. Hundreds of times. You've done it so often that your fingers have learned the exact pressure required to peel wet linen from broken skin without tearing what's left of it, the way another woman's fingers might learn the weight of a needle or the give of good dough. This is what they never wrote in the broadsheets. This is what nobody outside 4 rooms in Kensington Palace was ever meant to know. And what you are about to know tonight is the thing that was found in those rooms after she was gone. Not the crown, not the jewels, something smaller than that and heavier. But we are not there yet. First you need to understand who she was to you and who you were to her, because none of what happens later makes sense otherwise. Your name is Deborah Skeet. You're 17 years old in the year of our Lord 1706, and you have been in the bedchamber of Anne, Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland for exactly 1 year, 4 months and 11 days. Though you're the only person alive who is counting, you were not born to this. You came from a linen draper's family in Norwich, the 4th of 7 children, and you were placed here through a connection so distant and so thoroughly called in by your mother. A debt owed to a debt owed to a debt, 3 favours deep, the kind of chain that only works once in a family's whole existence, that you've never quite believed your own good fortune. You're not a lady of the bedchamber. You will never curtsy at the front of a procession or have your name written in a newspaper. You are a wardrobe woman, one of the underservants who mend, starch, fold, launder, and, because your hands are steady and you do not flinch, which turned out to matter more than your birth, dress and undress the wounds beneath the Queen's petticoats. There are perhaps 6 people in England who know exactly how sick this monarch truly is. You are one of them. You did not ask for that. It simply happened to your hands. The first time you saw the leg, you were sick afterward, quietly, into a basin in the closet where nobody could hear you. You were 16. The senior wardrobe woman, a flint-faced widow named Mrs. Prewitt, found you there with your hand pressed over your mouth and said only, "You'll get used to it, or you won't, and you'll go home to Norwich, and that's no shame either." You did not go home to Norwich. You got used to it, in the particular way a body gets used to cold water, not by stopping the shock, but by learning to work through it. Tonight in this room the fire is banked low because the Queen cannot bear too much heat against the swelling, though the rest of the palace burns coal like it costs nothing, which, for the people paying the bills, though not for you, it very nearly does. The air smells of beeswax candles, of the lavender water Mrs. Prewitt sprinkles on the sheets twice a day, and underneath both of those, unmistakable no matter how much lavender you use, the sweetish, faintly rotten smell of a body that retains water it cannot expel. You have learned not to breathe through your nose when you first enter. You have learned to breathe through your mouth in shallow sips until the smell stops registering as a smell and becomes simply the room. The Queen herself is propped on a mountain of pillows because she cannot lie flat. The fluid in her chest makes flat lying a slow suffocation. and her nightgown, made of the finest linen the royal wardrobe can supply, is soaked through at the collar with sweat she is too weak to wipe away herself. Her face, when you look at it directly, which you rarely do, is not the face from the coronation medals. It is broader now, redder, the skin pulled tight and shiny over cheeks that have not seen daylight in weeks. Her eyes, though, her eyes are sharp as ever, sharper than the eyes of women half her age and twice her health, and they are watching you unwrap the bandage on her left leg with the patient, assessing attention of someone who has had a great deal of practice enduring things she cannot change. "Well," she says in the flat, faintly nasal voice that 30 years of poor health has given her, "how bad is it tonight, Skeet?" You do not lie to her. You learned in your first month that she despises being lied to more than she despises pain itself. "There's fresh weeping on the inner side, Your Majesty. The old wound hasn't closed." "It never closes," she says, not bitterly, just stating a fact the way you might state that Tuesday follows Monday. "Get on with it, then. You get on with it." Your fingers work the wet linen loose in small tugging motions, a quarter inch at a time, because pulling faster tears the thin new skin trying to grow beneath the old wound, and tearing it means starting the healing over from nothing. The cloth has dried in places into a kind of crust, fused to the wound, and you have learned to press a cloth soaked in warm water and vinegar against those spots and wait, counting silently to 30 before you try again. The Queen's leg beneath your hands is hot, always hotter than the rest of her, a localized fever that never fully breaks, and swollen so tight that when you press 2 fingers gently against the shin, the dent they leave takes almost a full minute to rise back level with the surrounding skin. You've seen this in no other patient, because you've seen almost no other patient. Your entire education in the body's failures has come from this one body, over and over, for 1 year and 4 months and 11 days. She grips the coverlet with her free hand when you reach the worst of it, the split skin at the ankle where the swelling has simply outgrown what the flesh can hold, and a hiss escapes through her teeth. But she does not cry out. She's never once cried out in front of you, not in all this time, though you've felt her whole leg tremble under your palms with the effort of not doing so. You've come to understand, slowly, that this, the silence, the flat voice, the refusal to let pain show on her face where anyone might report it, is not coldness. It is the last thing she has left that nobody can take from her, the right to suffer without an audience. You finish cleaning the wound, pack it with a poultice of bread and milk that Dr. Arbuthnot swears reduces the inflammation faster than anything else he has tried, and begin winding fresh linen bandage around the ruined leg, over and under, the roll growing lighter in your hand as the cloth leaves it and wraps the swollen limb. Your shoulders ache from bending at this angle. Your knees, pressed against the hard floor beneath the bed for the better part of an hour now, have gone numb in a way that will turn to pins and needles the moment you stand. Somewhere beyond this room, beyond these 4 walls that hold the worst kept secret in England, the whole machinery of the government is running on the fiction that its monarch is merely indisposed, a word so soft and so useless that it could mean anything from a headache to what you are looking at right now. Ambassadors are writing letters home describing court gossip they gathered at a distance of 20 feet, through a closed door, from ladies who themselves were kept at a distance of 30. Nobody outside this room, and 5 or 6 others like it. A bedchamber woman here, a physician there, a groom of the stool who will one day be dismissed for talking too freely in a tavern. Nobody outside this small, exhausted circle knows what the Queen of England actually looks like beneath her clothes, and you are about to spend the better part of a decade finding out exactly how much more there is to know than even you suspect tonight, and exactly what will be left behind, hidden in plain sight among silk and lace, when there is finally nothing left of her to bandage, but that comes later. Tonight there is only the leg, and the linen, and the silence, and the small, private economy of trust between a servant girl from Norwich and a woman who rules 3 kingdoms and cannot tonight stand up on her own. You did not come to understand any of this in a single night. It took months, pieced together in fragments the way you might reconstruct a torn letter from scraps found in different pockets. A comment overheard here, a detail let slip there, the slow accumulation of things a servant is not told directly but absorbs anyway. The way damp gets into a wall nobody bothered to seal. The wardrobe rooms where you spend most of your working hours are 3 floors below the Queen's private apartments, a long, low gallery of a space with high shelves on every wall, each shelf labelled in Mrs. Prewitt's cramped hand: morning, undress, state occasions, linen, change, daily, linen, change, weekly. The air in the wardrobe room smells entirely different from the sick room above. Here it is starch and lavender, and the faint metallic tang of the flat irons heating on their trivet by the small fire kept burning year-round for pressing. Bolts of fabric lean against one wall like sleeping soldiers. Sober grey wool, black crepe, and, tucked at the very back, silks in colours nobody has worn in years, because the court has been in some degree of mourning for a decade and shows no sign of coming out of it. That is the first thing you learn that nobody warns you about. This queen has buried nearly everyone she loved. Mrs. Prewitt tells you the numbers one evening while you are both folding sheets. Her voice pitched low even though the room is empty, because some habits of discretion never turn off. 17 pregnancies, 17 over 18 years of marriage to Prince George of Denmark, a gentle, asthmatic man who loved her plainly and without ambition, and whom half the court considers a fool for it. Of the 17, most ended before they properly began, miscarried in the 2nd or 3rd month, sometimes announced to no one outside the bedchamber, sometimes not even to the bedchamber. 5 children were born alive. 4 of those died within hours or days, their lungs too weak, their small bodies unable to hold together what should have held together naturally. And one lived past infancy. A boy. William, Duke of Gloucester, sicklier than most children but stubborn in his own way, fond of playing at soldiers with a miniature regiment his father had made for him, a boy the whole nation had pinned its hope of a Protestant succession upon. He died 6 days after his 11th birthday in the summer of 1700, of a fever that came on fast and would not break. You were 11 years old yourself that summer, folding your own family's linen in Norwich, entirely unaware that the queen you would one day serve had, on the very same July day, lost the last child she would ever have who lived long enough to have a favourite toy. "She keeps his things," Mrs. Prewitt says, not looking up from the sheet in her hands, folding it into the same precise thirds she has folded 10,000 sheets into over a working lifetime. Not for show. Nobody sees them but her and the closet women when we're changing the linen presses. There's a little coat, a wooden soldier missing an arm, a lock of hair in a paper twist, the paper gone soft as cloth from handling. She pauses. "You'll see it yourself one day, when you're trusted with that closet. Don't say anything when you do. She doesn't want comfort. She wants it left exactly where it is. You file this away the way you have learned to file everything in this place. Carefully, silently, in a part of your mind that has grown steadily larger since you arrived. A room inside yourself with shelves like the wardrobe gallery, labelled things you may never say aloud. The days settle into a rhythm you did not expect a royal household to have, because you had imagined before you came that the lives of queens were made of nothing but ceremony, processions and banquets and the glitter of state occasions blazing one after another like a chain of bonfires. The reality is quieter and far more physical than that. Mornings begin before the sun properly clears the trees in the palace gardens, with you and 2 other underservants hauling water for the laundry coppers, your palms already blistered in the same 2 places they blister every week, because no amount of calluses seems to toughen that particular stretch of skin against a bucket's rope handle. The water has to be heated over a fire that spits and complains if the wood is even slightly damp, and by mid-morning your face is red and slick from the steam, your hair sticking to your temples in damp curls no cap can fully contain. Laundry is not simply washing. Laundry in a royal household is a war fought daily against starch that clumps if you don't beat it smooth, against irons that scorch linen the instant your attention wanders, against grease stains from candle wax that has to be lifted with brown paper and a hot iron pressed just so, blotting the wax up through the paper rather than driving it deeper into the weave. Your hands by the end of most days are cracked at the knuckles, the skin gone tight and papery from hours in hot water and lye soap, and at night you rub them with a tallow ointment Mrs. Prewitt keeps in a chipped jar, though it does little more than slow the cracking rather than stop it, and always, threaded through the ordinary labour, there is the other work, the closet work, the bandage work, the particular silence required of anyone who has seen the Queen's body as it actually is rather than as the engravings show it. You learn to change your voice when you leave that sick room, to smooth your face back into the blank, pleasant nothing expected of servants before you've even reached the bottom of the private stair. You learn that the biggest secrets in England are not kept behind locked doors with armed men outside them. They are kept behind the much simpler, much more fragile door of a 17-year-old girl's discretion, and the discretion of 5 or 6 others exactly like her, none of whom would ever be believed even if they did talk, and all of whom understand without ever discussing it that talking is not a thing that is done. There is one more presence in these early months that you cannot avoid learning about, because everyone in the household speaks of her constantly, in tones that range from awe to fear to something close to worship. Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough. You have not yet met her properly. She moves through the grandest rooms of the palace, not the wardrobe galleries, but you have watched her from a distance, once crossing a gallery with the Queen leaning on her arm, and you have never seen 2 women stand so close together while occupying such entirely different heights of confidence. The Duchess walks as though the floor itself has been specifically instructed to hold her weight without complaint. The Queen beside her moves like a woman managing pain with every step, and determined that it show as little as possible. They have known each other since they were girls, Mrs. Prewitt tells you, since before either of them was anyone at all, back when the Queen was merely the Princess Anne, a shy, plain, overlooked younger daughter with a stammer and a weak chest, and Sarah Jennings was the sharpest, most confident girl at court, 6 years her senior in wit if not in years. The princess had attached herself to Sarah the way a person clings to a rock in a current. and Sarah, for reasons that were partly affection and partly the ordinary ambition of a clever woman without a fortune of her own, had let her. They wrote to each other under private names for decades, Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, so that rank would never come between what they said to one another on paper, and by the time the princess became the Queen, Sarah Churchill, now Duchess of Marlborough, married to the greatest general in Europe, had become the single most powerful woman in England who was not sitting on the throne herself. She runs half this household from memory, Mrs. Prewitt says of the Duchess, with the particular flatness of someone reporting a fact she has decided not to have an opinion about, out loud at least. Knows every appointment before it's made, every pension before it's granted. Her Majesty trusts her the way you'd trust your own hand. A pause while she smooths a fold flat with the edge of her thumbnail, which is a great deal of trust to put in a hand that has its own ideas about where it wants to go. You do not understand in these early months what that last sentence means. You will understand it very well indeed in time, and you will be standing close enough to watch the exact moment that trust finally breaks. Closer, in fact, than almost anyone else in England will be permitted to stand. For now, though, your world is small and physical, and mostly made of linen and lye, and the slow, patient unwrapping of a leg that will never properly heal. You go to bed each night in the narrow room you share with two other wardrobe women above the laundry, where the air always smells faintly of drying starch no matter how well the windows are aired, and you sleep the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has been working since before dawn. And in the morning the bells of the palace chapel wake you before your own eyes do, and you rise and you go back to it, and this becomes, without your ever quite deciding it should, the entire shape of your life. The chair arrives in the spring of 1707, and it changes the physical shape of your days more than anything since you first learned to dress the wound on her leg. By this point, the Queen can no longer reliably walk from one room to another without two people supporting her weight, and even with support the effort leaves her breathless and grey-faced for a quarter-hour afterward. The carpenters and engineers who serve the royal works have built, on the instruction of people far above your station, a wheeled chair, a solid high-backed thing upholstered in crimson, mounted on a chassis of iron-shod wheels, with long poles fitted to either side so that it can be carried up staircases like a sedan when the ground floor will not do, and rolled like a cart when it will. There is talk, too, of a mechanism for the stairs themselves at Windsor, a system of ropes and pulleys, a kind of hoist built into a small closet beside the main staircase, so that the chair itself can be raised a full story without a single footman straining his back. You have not seen this second device yet. You will, eventually, and you will think, the first time you watch it operate, that it is the strangest sight you have witnessed in this entire strange household. A queen ascending to her own bedchamber inside a box, hauled up on ropes like cargo winched from the hold of a ship, while below her, out of sight, 4 men grunt and heave in perfect silence, because noise is not permitted near her rooms after a certain hour. Your part in all of this is smaller and less mechanical, but no less exhausting. Someone has to steady the Queen while she is transferred from bed to chair, and the task has fallen more often than not to whichever wardrobe woman happens to be nearest and has hands free of anything that might be dropped. You learn the particular geometry of it, how to brace your own knees against the frame of the bed, how to loop your forearm beneath hers, not at the wrist, which is too easily wrenched, but higher, near the elbow, where the bone offers something to hold against. You learn that she is heavier now than any single person, however strong, can lift cleanly, and that the operation therefore always requires at least 3 of you working together, counting under your breath, 1, 2, 3, before the actual heave, because if even one person moves a half-second early, the whole manoeuvre buckles, and someone, usually you, ends up half crushed against the bed frame with the Queen's full weight briefly upon your shoulder. She hates this. She has never said so in words, not to you. But you have felt it in the way her whole body goes rigid during the transfer, the muscles of her face locked into an expression of perfect neutrality that costs her more effort, you suspect, than the physical lift itself. A woman who was once, you've seen the old portraits, hung in a gallery you pass twice daily, slim enough to be painted riding side saddle at a gallop, reduced now to being hoisted like a sack of grain between 3 servant girls and a set of iron wheels. You understand, without either of you ever discussing it, that your job in these moments is not only to hold her weight, but to hold your own face equally still, to let no flicker of pity or strain cross it. Because pity is the one thing she has told Mrs. Prewitt, once, in a rare, unguarded moment, that she cannot abide from the people who see her at her worst. The war reaches you the same way most things reach the wardrobe rooms, sideways, in fragments, weeks after it has already happened somewhere far across the sea. You hear the name Blenheim spoken with a kind of reverence that means it must be important before you understand why. A great victory, someone says. The Duke of Marlborough, Sarah's husband, the general everyone speaks of as though he personally invented the art of war, has smashed the French and Bavarian armies on a riverbank in a country you've never heard of, and could not find on any map if your life depended on it. Bells ring across London for 3 days. A vast house is to be built for the Duke and Duchess at public expense, out past Oxford, in gratitude, and its foundations are already being dug, though the war itself shows no sign of ending. You feel none of the triumph directly. What you feel, instead, filtering down through the household in the weeks and months that follow, is the enormous appetite the war has for money, and the enormous appetite that appetite has for taxes, and how those taxes turn, eventually, into questions asked in low voices about whether the war should continue at all, and who benefits from it continuing, and whether the Marlboroughs, General and Duchess both, have grown a little too accustomed to running the country as though it were their own household account book. You do not understand the politics of it, not properly, not for years. What you understand is simpler and more immediate, that every letter which comes into this palace from the continent seems to make the Duchess of Marlborough's voice a little louder in the corridors, and the Queen's own voice, by contrast, a little quieter. It is around this time, the spring the chair arrives, the spring of Blenheim's long glittering afterglow, that you first notice the other woman, not the Duchess. Someone smaller, quieter, dressed with the plain neatness of a woman who understands she has no fortune and no family behind her, worth mentioning, moving through the bedchamber apartments with a broom or a basin or an armful of linen, exactly the kind of unremarkable presence you yourself have spent a year learning to become. Her name, you learn, is Abigail Hill. She's a poor cousin of the Duchess of Marlborough's own family, brought into royal service as a bedchamber woman through Sarah's own patronage, the same way half the useful people in this palace owe their positions to someone else's decision to be kind or useful or both, once. Nobody pays her much attention in these early months. She is quiet in a way that could be shyness, or could be something else entirely. A deliberate, practiced quiet. The kind you yourself have learned to wear like a second skin around a woman who despises being watched too closely. You notice, though, because it is your business to notice small physical things, that the Queen's eyes follow Abigail Hill differently than they follow the Duchess of Marlborough. When Sarah enters a room, the Queen's whole body seems to brace itself, the way yours does before the 3-count lift from bed to chair, an anticipation of being handled, managed, moved, according to someone else's timing. When the quiet cousin enters, carrying nothing more dramatic than a fresh basin of water, the Queen's shoulders, if anything, seem to loosen very slightly, as though this particular presence asks nothing of her at all. You do not think anything of this at the time. You're 17 years old, your hands are cracked from lye soap, and you have a leg to bandage before the evening bell. It will be years before you understand that you watched, without knowing it, the very first small motion of a slow and enormous shift, the kind that changes the government of 3 kingdoms, though it begins with nothing grander than the difference between 2 women's basins of water, and the particular way a tired, sick, endlessly managed queen prefers to be touched. There is one more thing that happens in these early years that reaches even the wardrobe rooms, and that is the union. You do not fully grasp, when it happens, what it means for 2 separate kingdoms to become one. For Scotland and England, which have shared a monarch for 100 years, but kept their own parliaments, their own laws, their own suspicions of one another, to be folded together on paper into a single kingdom of Great Britain. What you grasp is smaller and more concrete. An extra day of formal dress in May of 1707, extra linen to be pressed for the state occasion, extra silence expected in the corridors while important men in robes process past toward the House of Lords, and afterward a rare and genuine brightness in the Queen's face when Mrs. Pruitt brings her the freshly changed linen that evening, the closest thing to unguarded pleasure you have yet seen her allow herself. She wanted this more than almost anything, Mrs. Pruitt tells you afterward, folding the discarded gown with unusual care. One island, one parliament. No more fear of the Scots crowning some Catholic pretender the moment she's in her grave and leaving England to fight a war on its own doorstep. A pause. She won't live to see whether it holds, but she did it. Whatever else they say of her, and they say a great deal, mostly unkind, she did that. You fold linen. You change bandages. You watch a quiet cousin move through rooms with a basin, and a duchess move through the same rooms like weather, and a queen grow slowly heavier and slower and further from the woman in the gallery portraits, while somewhere far above your understanding, one island quietly becomes one kingdom, and nobody in the wardrobe rooms is entirely sure yet whether any of it will hold together at all. You finally see the Windsor hoist for yourself that same autumn, when the whole household removes to the castle for several weeks, and you're sent up ahead with 2 other wardrobe women to have the private apartments properly aired and the linen presses stocked before the Queen's own arrival. The de-ice sits in a narrow closet built into the thickness of the old stone wall beside the principal staircase, a squat wooden platform just large enough to hold the wheeled chair, suspended on thick hempen ropes that run up through a shaft cut into the ceiling and disappear into machinery you never see, worked by men stationed on the floor above who cannot see what they are hauling, only feel the weight of it on the rope and count. The same way you count during the bed-to-chair lift before they heave in unison. You're given cause to ride up in the ordinary supply platform yourself one grey October morning, standing pressed against a stack of folded bed hangings, because there is no other way to get them up to the state apartments quickly, and you find the whole short ascent more frightening than any single night of tending the leg has ever been. The platform lurches once, hard, when the men above first take up the slack in the rope, and your stomach drops with it, your hands flying out to grip the low wooden rail on either side, the rope creaking audibly overhead with a sound like a ship's timbers working in a swell. You can feel every small unevenness in the men's pulling translated straight up through the boards beneath your feet. A slight jerk, a slight pause, the platform swaying a finger's width from the stone wall it rises past, close enough that your shoulder brushes cold. Damp stone twice before you reach the top and the platform settles, with a final shuddering thump onto its resting ledge. You think, stepping off it with your knees gone momentarily unsteady, of the Queen herself riding up this same narrow shaft, sealed inside her own chair, unable to see the rope or the men or gauge for herself how much farther there is to rise, trusting her whole weight to 4 unseen strangers' straining arms, and a length of hemp that could, in theory, fray or slip or simply give way with no warning at all. You understand, standing there catching your breath in the cold stone stairwell, exactly why she insists, whenever there is any choice in the matter, on being carried the ordinary way by poles and men she can see and speak to, rather than hauled blind through a wall in the dark. It is not vanity, whatever the lesser wits of the court might whisper. It is simply that a woman who has lost nearly every other form of control over her own body still wants, when she can have it, the small mercy of knowing exactly whose hands are holding her up. The errand that sends you back down to the town of Windsor itself that same evening is a smaller thing entirely. A forgotten box of pins and thread left behind at the last lodging, needed urgently for a torn hem before morning. But it teaches you something about danger that has nothing to do with hoists or ropes at all. You go alone, because the other 2 women are occupied and the errand is judged simple enough for 1 pair of legs, and by the time you have retrieved the box and started back up the long dark lane toward the castle gate, the light has gone entirely, no moon showing through a low thick cloud, and you are walking by nothing more than the memory of the road's own shape beneath your feet. You hear footsteps behind you, perhaps halfway along, matching your pace too closely to be accidental, and your whole body goes cold and alert in an instant, every hair on your arms lifting, the box of pins clutched hard enough against your chest that the corner digs into your collarbone. You do not run. You've heard enough second-hand from footmen who walk this road at night regularly to know that running only invites a chase. But you do quicken your steps, breathing shallow and fast through your nose, straining your ears past the sound of your own heartbeat for any change in the pace behind you. The footsteps quicken to match yours exactly, and for one long, terrible stretch of perhaps 30 paces you are certain, with the flat, sourceless certainty of pure fear, that whoever is behind you means you serious harm. And then a lantern swings into view ahead, carried by a castle watchman making his own slow round of the outer walls, and the footsteps behind you fall back and back again. And by the time you reach the lantern's light and glance behind you, there is no one on the road at all. Only darkness and the faint retreating scuff of someone else's boots finding a different path entirely. You do not know, to this day, whether it was ever anything more than another frightened traveller keeping pace with the only other person on a dark road for the simple comfort of not being alone in it. You only know that your hands did not stop shaking until you were safely back inside the castle's outer gate, and that you slept that night, and many nights after, with the memory of that particular darkness pressing close against the back of your eyes. Prince George dies in the autumn of 1708, on a Thursday night in October, at Kensington, in a set of rooms not far from the ones you spend half your life in, and you're close enough to the event that you hear the exact sound it makes when a queen's whole household realizes, all at once, that the one uncomplicated relationship in her entire life has just ended. He has been ill for a long time before that. A wheezing, heavy man, kind by every account you've ever heard, devoted to his wife in the plain, undemanding way of someone who never once tried to manage her the way half the court manages her, content simply to sit with her of an evening and say little. His lungs have been failing for months, the asthma that has dogged him for years finally winning the argument his body has been having with itself since long before you arrived. You're not present at the actual death. You're 3 rooms away, folding morning crepe that Mrs. Prewitt has already, with grim foresight, ordered brought up from the wardrobe stores 2 days before anyone has said the word dying aloud. What you're present for is the hour after. You hear it first as a change in the quality of silence, the particular hush that falls over a household when something has happened that nobody yet has the words to announce. Then a door somewhere down the gallery opened and not properly closed, and through the gap a sound you have never heard the Queen make before and will remember for the rest of your life. Not screaming, not sobbing in the theatrical way you might have expected of a lesser woman freed for once from the obligation to appear composed, but something lower and worse, a kind of steady broken moaning, the sound a body makes when grief has gone past the reach of words entirely and simply has to be let out through the chest over and over because there is nowhere else for it to go. You do not go to her. It is not your place, and besides, the Duchess of Marlborough is already there, has been there within minutes, you learn later, summoned or simply arrived on her own certainty that she is needed, and for one long strange night the Queen allows herself to be held and rocked like a child by the one person in England still permitted to touch her without ceremony. You think, hearing it through the gap in the door, that whatever else is true of the Duchess, whatever ambition or arrogance the rest of the household whispers about her, she's not pretending in that room. Nobody could counterfeit a night like that one. The morning that follows is the deepest you've seen since you arrived. Black for the whole court for months, the wardrobe rooms working around the clock to keep the household properly and uniformly draped in grief, and the Queen herself retreating from almost every public duty for weeks, conducting the barest necessary business from behind a closed door. You change her linen, you dress the leg, you say nothing, because there is nothing to say that would not be an intrusion, and you have learned by now, better than most people twice your age, the specific etiquette of grief. How to be present and useful and entirely invisible all at once. How to let your hands do the comforting. Your voice is not permitted to attempt. It is in the months after Prince George's death, in the long grey stretch of 1709 sliding into 1710, that you begin to notice the second, quieter thing happening alongside the Queen's grief, which is the slow, grinding deterioration of her friendship with the Duchess of Marlborough. You piece it together the way you piece together everything. A raised voice through a door here, a letter left half torn on a side table there, The particular stiffness that comes into Mrs. Prewitt's shoulders whenever the Duchess's name comes up in conversation among the senior women. The war that made the Duke a hero has gone on for years now, with no clear end, costing more money and more English lives with every campaigning season, and the appetite for it in Parliament and in the coffee houses, and, you gather, though you have never set foot in a coffee house in your life, in the wardrobe rooms of half of London has curdled into something closer to resentment, and the Duchess, who has spent 30 years managing the Queen the way a general manages a campaign, cannot seem to stop managing her now, at precisely the moment the Queen has begun, quietly, to want to be managed less. The quiet cousin, Abigail Hill, has become something rather less quiet in the meantime. She has married a gentleman of the bedchamber to Prince George before his death, a match arranged so discreetly that even the Duchess, by all accounts, did not learn of it until well after the fact, which you gather she took as something close to a personal betrayal. Mrs. Masham, she is called now, and Mrs. Masham has become, without ever raising her voice in any corridor you have walked down, the person the Queen increasingly prefers to have nearby of an evening, the one who asks nothing, manages nothing, argues for no minister and against no policy, simply sits and pours the tea and lets the silence be whatever silence the Queen wants it to be that night. You are given, around this time, a task that tells you more plainly than any gossip could where the true centre of gravity in this household has shifted. Mrs. Prewitt, without explanation, begins sending you rather than one of the more senior women to deliver certain small parcels of mended linen directly to Mrs. Masham's own rooms, a set of modest chambers tucked into a corner of the palace, nowhere near as grand as the Duchess of Marlborough's own splendid lodgings, and you understand, delivering the third or fourth such parcel, that you're being quietly trained toward a future in which the address that matters is no longer the grand one. The final rupture, when it comes in the depth of winter in January of 1711, and you are not in the room for it. Nobody outside two people is, but you are close enough, in the corridor beyond, folding a stack of newly pressed shifts with hands that have gone very still and very slow, to hear most of what passes between them, because neither woman, in the end, manages to keep her voice as low as either of them surely intended. The Duchess has come, you gather from what filters through the door, to demand the return of certain private letters, the old affectionate letters written across 30 years under their private names, Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, letters that speak of a friendship neither of them can any longer pretend still exists in the shape it once did. There is talk, too, of a gold key, and of jewels given long ago as tokens between friends who never imagined a day would come when such gifts might need to be returned like a debt called in. The Queen's voice, when you can make out its shape through the door, is flatter and colder than you've ever heard it, even on the nights you have caused her the worst physical pain with a badly timed bandage change. The Duchess's voice, by contrast, rises and cracks in a way you would never have believed possible from a woman who has always seemed made of the same iron as the palace gates. "I will have my letters back," the Duchess says, and her voice on that sentence carries clean through the door. "Every one of them, before I set foot from this room." Whatever the Queen answers, you do not hear clearly, but you hear, unmistakably, the particular quality of a silence that follows a decision already made and no longer open to argument, and you hear, some minutes later, the door open with more force than doors in this palace are generally permitted, and the Duchess of Marlborough walk past you down the corridor with her face composed into something that is trying very hard to be dignity and only partially succeeding, her eyes bright and hard, and she does not look at you at all, because to her you have never once been anything but a piece of the furniture, and today of all days that is precisely what you're grateful to be. She is gone from the household within weeks, stripped eventually of every office she has held for 30 years, her rooms at St. James's and Kensington both given over to other hands, and Mrs. Masham, plain, quiet, undemanding Mrs. Masham, becomes, without any ceremony at all, the woman who sits closest to the Queen's chair of an evening, pouring the tea, asking for nothing, managing nothing, and somehow, in exactly that nothing, becoming the most powerful woman in England for a season or two, in precisely the way nobody who watched her scrub floors alongside you 3 years earlier would ever have predicted. You think about this sometimes, on the nights when your own hands ache too much to sleep straight away. How easily the whole architecture of a friendship that outlasted decades, wars and 17 pregnancies could be brought down. In the end, not by any grand betrayal, but by simple exhaustion. The exhaustion of being managed by someone who loves you and cannot stop treating that love as a kind of ownership. You think, too, though you would never say it to anyone, that you understand the Queen's choice better than most of the fine ladies at court seem to, because you yourself have learned, at her bedside, exactly how much a tired, suffering body values a hand that asks for nothing in return. It is not until the summer after the Duchess's fall, a hot close July in 1711, the kind of summer that turns the Thames sluggish and foul-smelling, even this far from the city proper, that the Queen asks something of you directly for the first time in all your years of service. You're alone with her that afternoon, which itself is unusual. Mrs. Prewitt has gone to oversee a delivery of new bed linen, and the other women are occupied elsewhere, and you're simply finishing the change of dressing on the leg, packing away the soiled cloths into the covered basket you carry them out in, when she says, without any particular preamble, "Skeet, fetch the small ebony box from the top shelf of the linen press, the one with the brass corners." You have seen this box before, from a distance, dusted around rather than dusted properly, the way one avoids handling a thing that clearly does not belong to the ordinary business of the room. You fetch it now, careful with both hands, and bring it to where she sits propped against her pillows, and she takes it from you and sets it in her lap, and simply looks at it for a long moment before she opens the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue silk, are the things Mrs. Prewitt told you about, years ago now, in a voice pitched low over a stack of folded sheets. A small coat, no bigger than something you might dress a large doll in, cut in miniature imitation of a grown man's military coat, the buttons real brass gone dull with age, a wooden soldier, one arm broken off cleanly at the shoulder and never mended, its painted face worn nearly featureless by the pressure of small fingers that stopped pressing it 11 years ago. And a twist of paper, soft as cloth now from handling, containing a single curled lock of pale hair. He would be 22 this year, the Queen says. Not to you exactly, more to the box itself or to the air above it. 22. He'd have a wife by now, children of his own if God had been kinder than he was. She touches the lock of hair with one finger, not lifting it, simply resting the fingertip against the paper as though checking that it is still real. Everyone in this palace believes I have made my peace with it. I have not made my peace with it. I have only learned to keep the door of this box closed most days, which is not the same thing at all, though people mistake the two constantly. You say nothing because there is nothing to say. and because you have learned more thoroughly than almost any lesson in your life that this woman does not want comfort offered to her in words. She wants a hand that is steady, and a face that does not flinch, and a silence that leaves room for whatever she chooses to say into it. I'm going to tell you something, Skeet, and I want you to understand that I am telling very few people this, and that I expect it to remain exactly where I have put it. She closes the lid of the box slowly and holds it out to you rather than setting it back on the shelf herself. When I am gone, and I am not a fool, girl, I know better than my physicians do how much longer I am likely to have. There will be a great many people in this palace with a great deal of interest in what is found in these rooms. Ministers wanting papers, heralds wanting jewels for the crown's account, relations wanting whatever they can carry off before anyone thinks to stop them. I do not care what happens to my jewels. I do not much care, God forgive me, what happens to my gowns. Her hand rests briefly, heavily on the lid of the box. This is not for any of them. This was never a state possession. It is the only thing I have left that is entirely mine, and I would have it stay mine even after I can no longer insist upon it. What would your Majesty have me do, you ask, because the question seems to be waiting there, wanting an answer. Nothing, for now. Simply know where it is, and know that it matters more than anything else in this room, more than the jewels in the case by the window, more than any paper Mr. Harley or anyone after him might come looking for. If a day comes when the rooms are being gone through, and nobody's minding this particular shelf closely enough, you will know what to do with your hands even if nobody tells you what to do with your voice. She looks at you then, properly, the sharp eyes taking your measure in a way that makes you feel, not for the first time, considerably younger than 17. You're older now, 22 yourself, though the feeling of being newly arrived and unequal to the household's weight has never fully left you. You have kept every other secret I've given your hands to keep. I do not imagine this one will be any different. You take the box back to its shelf. You say, "Yes, Your Majesty," because it is the only true and complete answer available to you, and you go on with the rest of the afternoon's work as though nothing at all has passed between you, because that too is part of what she is trusting you to do. You do not speak of this to Mrs. Prewitt or to anyone. It settles into the same private room inside you where you've been storing secrets for 6 years now, on a shelf of its own, and you find in the weeks that follow that you check the ebony box's presence on the linen press shelf almost without meaning to, the way your tongue might check that a loose tooth is still in place. A small anxious habit you cannot quite train yourself out of. It is that same summer, on one of the rare full days you're given free of the wardrobe rooms, that you climb, with 2 of the other underservants, up the long grassy slope of Richmond Hill on a Sunday afternoon, because a footman named Josiah, a good-natured, freckled young man you have known since your first year, and who has recently begun finding excuses to walk in whatever direction you happen to be walking, has told you the view from the top is worth the climb, and because a whole day away from linen and lye and the smell of a wound that never closes is not a thing you're willing to waste sitting indoors. The climb itself leaves you breathless in a way that has nothing to do with sickness, your skirts gathered in one fist to keep from tripping on the rougher ground, your other hand occasionally finding a low branch or a jutting root for balance. By the time you reach the crest, your face is flushed and your lungs are working hard and pleasantly, in the ordinary way of a body simply being young and active rather than tending someone else's failing one. And the view that opens out below you is worth every step of the climb, exactly as promised. The Thames curls below in a long silver loop, catching the afternoon sun in bright, moving fragments, dotted with the small dark shapes of barges and wherries going about their unhurried Sunday business. Beyond the river, the land rolls away in patchwork fields, hedgerows drawn in dark green stitching between them, and further still, hazed by distance and the faint permanent smudge of London's coal smoke, you can just make out the low grey sprawl of the city itself, and somewhere within it, invisible from here but present in your mind the way a held breath is present, the palace where all your daily labour happens, and the woman in it who has just entrusted you with the single most private thing she owns. You can see almost to St. Paul's on a clear day, Josiah says beside you, shading his eyes with one hand, and you realise, standing there with the wind pulling loose strands of hair free of your cap, that this is the first time in 6 years you have seen the palace and everything inside it from any distance at all. The first time you've been high enough and far enough away to see it as a small, contained thing, one part of a much larger, ordinary, sunlit country that goes on being ordinary and sunlit whether or not the woman in the ebony boxed rooms below is dying by degrees. It is, you think, standing there with the grass moving around your ankles and the whole wide valley spread beneath you, the closest you have come in years to simply being a girl of 22 on a Sunday afternoon, rather than a servant who knows things she was not permitted to say. You let yourself have it for an hour before the walk back down the hill returns you, step by step, to everything waiting below. The seasons turn over after that the way they always do, faster than seems fair when you try to account for where the time has gone. Another winter of gout so severe the Queen cannot hold a pen steady enough to sign her own name, and has to be helped hand over hand by whichever secretary is patient enough for it. Another spring of cautious improvement, walks taken in a garden chair pushed at a snail's pace along gravel paths, her face turned up toward whatever thin sunlight the English climate is willing to offer. Ministries rise and fall around her in a churn of Whig and Tory factions you understand only dimly, names spoken with reverence or contempt depending on which senior servant is speaking them. Mr. Harley, elevated now to Earl of Oxford, managing the government with the same careful, undemonstrative patience that made his cousin Mrs. Masham the Queen's favoured companion in the first place. Talk, eventually, of peace with France, a treaty being hammered out at a place called Utrecht that will end, if it ever concludes, more than a decade of war whose only tangible presence in your own life has been the morning crepe you pressed for men you never met, and the taxes that made everyone's bread cost more than it once did. You're 25 years old in the spring of 1714. You have spent very nearly your entire adult life inside the same set of rooms, tending the same failing body, keeping the same accumulating store of secrets, and you have no way of knowing, as that spring turns toward a hot, still summer, that you are also, without anyone telling you so, entering the final months of the only working life you've ever known. July of that year arrives thick and airless, the kind of heat that settles over London like a wet blanket, and refuses to lift even after sundown, and it is in this heat that you first notice the change in her that frightens you more than any single symptom you have catalogued across 9 years of service. It is not the leg this time, though the leg is no better than it has ever been. It is her mind, or rather the speed of it, the sharp, assessing eyes that have tracked your every movement since you were 17 years old, now taking a half-second longer than they used to, a small but unmistakable lag, to follow you across the room. It is the way she asks you. one Tuesday morning, to fetch a shawl she's already wearing, and looks faintly puzzled for the briefest instant when you point this out to her, before the sharpness reasserts itself and she waves the whole moment away with an irritated flick of her hand, as though daring you to have noticed anything at all. You have not stopped noticing. You have simply, as with everything else in this room, learned to keep the noticing behind your face. The physicians come more frequently now, a rotating parade of solemn men in dark coats. Dr. Arbuthnot chief among them, a Scotsman with kind eyes and a habit of talking to the Queen as though she were a reasonable colleague in the business of keeping her alive rather than a patient to be managed, which you have come to think is the real reason she tolerates him better than most of his profession. They speak among themselves in low voices thick with Latin words you do not understand, and you have learned to read their faces instead of their language. The particular tightness around Arbuthnot's mouth that means the news, whatever it is not good, and the way he glances, more and more often this summer, not at the Queen herself, but at the door, as though calculating how much time remains before whatever is coming through it arrives. Feeding her has become, by this July, a task requiring almost as much delicacy as dressing the wound. Her appetite comes and goes in strange, unpredictable tides. Some days she can manage nothing beyond a little broth, spooned slowly, her throat working with visible effort around each swallow, her breath catching afterward as though the simple act of eating has cost her something significant. You have learned to sit at just the right angle, the bowl balanced on your own knee so that both your hands are free, one to steady the spoon and one to press a napkin gently beneath her chin, because her hands shake too badly now to manage the task herself without spilling, and she cannot abide the indignity of being seen with broth down the front of her gown, even by you, even after 9 years of seeing far worse. Her skin, too, has begun to trouble you in ways it did not before. The prolonged pressure of lying and sitting in the same few positions day after day has begun to break down patches on her lower back and the backs of her thighs. Not wounds from any injury, but sores that simply arise from a body too heavy and too immobile to shift its own weight properly, the skin dying slowly in the places where it's asked to bear too much for too long without relief. You turn her now, with Mrs. Prewitt and another woman, every few hours, gently rolling her onto her side and packing pillows behind her to hold the new position, checking each time for the telltale reddened patches that mean a sore is beginning, dabbing them with a solution of brandy and water that stings enough to make her hiss through her teeth, even in her present state, half drowsing much of the day from sheer exhaustion. The smell of the room has changed too over these final weeks, in ways your nose registers before your mind fully admits what it means. Underneath the lavender water and the beeswax candles there is now a heavier, more persistent note, the smell of a body's ordinary functions no longer entirely under its own control, a smell you clean away as quickly and as gently as you can each time it arises, because you understand, without either of you ever saying so, that this particular indignity is the one that would wound her most deeply of all, if she were fully aware of how thoroughly it is managed by other hands than her own. You are not the only one who has noticed the acceleration. The palace itself, in these last weeks of July, has taken on a strange, charged quality you have never felt in it before. A sense of many important men moving quickly and quietly through corridors where, in ordinary times, they would have strolled at a leisurely, self-important pace. You catch fragments of it in the wardrobe rooms, where gossip travels faster than almost anywhere else in the building, precisely because nobody important thinks servants worth guarding their tongues around. The Earl of Oxford, Mr. Harley, as you still think of him despite the title, has fallen out badly with the Queen only days before, over some matter of ministerial rivalry you understand only in the vaguest outline, and has been dismissed from his post in a fit of the same flat, cold anger you once heard through a door directed at the Duchess of Marlborough. And behind that dismissal, unspoken but understood by everyone from the greatest lord to the lower scullery girl, sits the one question that has hung over this entire reign since before you were even born into it. Who exactly is meant to sit on the throne when this woman, who's now buried every child God ever gave her, finally follows them? The law is supposed to have settled it years ago, an Act of Parliament naming a distant Protestant relation, the Elector of Hanover, a German prince most of the household has never seen and few could confidently describe, as the heir who must succeed rather than any nearer Catholic claimant. But laws on paper and the actual scramble of ambitious men in the final hours of a reign are, you gather from the tightness in every senior voice around you, two very different animals, and there are those in this palace. You hear their names spoken in tones ranging from suspicion to outright accusation, who are rumoured to favour another path entirely, a restoration of the old exiled line, whatever the statute books say. You do not understand the finer points of any of it. What you understand, watching the corridors fill and empty with unusually fast-walking men in dark coats, is that everyone above your station in this building has begun, in the last week of July, to behave as though a clock only they can hear has started counting down towards something none of them are fully prepared for. On the 29th of July, a Thursday, you are called to the bedchamber earlier than your usual hour, roused from a thin, uneasy sleep by Mrs. Prewitt's hand on your shoulder and her face, in the candlelight, drawn tighter than you have ever seen it. "She's had a bad night," is all Mrs. Prewitt says. "Come." The Queen is awake when you arrive, propped against her pillows, but there is something wrong with the shape of her face that you register before you can put words to it. A slight unnatural droop at the left corner of her mouth, as though the muscles there have simply stopped answering some of the commands sent to them. When Dr. Arbuthnot arrives, moments after you do, his own face goes through a rapid, controlled sequence of professional composure, clamping down hard over something else entirely, and he asks her, gently, to squeeze his hand, and you watch her right hand grip his fingers with something close to her old sharpness, and her left hand lie in her lap and barely respond at all. Nobody says the word aloud in front of you that afternoon, but you have spent 9 years learning to read rooms rather than voices, and you understand, from the sudden increase in traffic through the outer chambers, from the messengers you see mounting horses in the courtyard below, with an urgency that has nothing to do with ordinary court business, from the particular grey stillness that settles over Mrs. Prewitt's whole face when she thinks no one is watching her, exactly what has happened, even before anyone confirms it to you directly. Something has broken loose in her head, the way something has already broken down in her leg and her back and her heart, and this time there will be no bandage that fixes it, no poultice of bread and milk that reduces the swelling by morning. The last 2 days pass in a blur of small, exhausting tasks that you perform with a steadiness you do not feel, because steadiness has become, after 9 years, the only thing you know how to offer a room in crisis. You're not permitted at the bedside itself during these final hours. That space belongs to the physicians, to the great officers of the household, to Mrs. Masham, who scarcely leaves the room at all, and whose face, glimpsed briefly each time the door opens, has gone the pale, flattened grey of someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. Your place, along with Mrs. Prewitt and two of the other wardrobe women, is in the antechamber beyond, close enough to be summoned the instant a fresh cloth or a change of linen is needed, far enough that you spend most of your last hours of service to this queen listening to her dying through a closed door rather than watching it happen directly. It is, in its own way, worse than watching would have been. Your imagination fills in every gap the door leaves you, and your imagination, sharpened by 9 years of exact and intimate knowledge of that particular body, fills the gaps with more precision and more dread than a stranger's mind ever could. You know exactly what the laboured breathing sounds like when it comes muffled through oak panelling, because you have heard the unmuffled version too many times to count, on nights when a bad turn in the leg kept her from lying flat and forced her to fight for every breath through the small hours. You know from the particular cadence of the physicians' voices when the door opens briefly to pass out a used basin, exactly how worried they are, because you have learned to read that cadence as fluently as you once learned to read the colour of a wound. On the night of the 31st, past midnight, you're sitting on a hard bench in the antechamber with Mrs. Prewitt beside you, both of you too exhausted to speak and too wound tight to sleep, when the sounds from beyond the door change in a way that makes every hair on your arms rise at once. The low, steady murmur of physicians' voices, which has continued almost without pause for 2 days, stops entirely. There is a silence that stretches longer than any silence has any right to stretch, and into it, faintly, you hear what you will later understand was Mrs. Masham's voice, breaking on a single indrawn breath that is not quite a sob and not quite a word, simply the sound of a person absorbing news before the mind has caught up enough to shape a proper response to it. Then the door opens, and Dr. Arbuthnot stands in the frame, and his face tells you everything before he says a single word. "Her Majesty," he says, and his voice, usually so steady, catches once before he steadies it again by force, "has departed this life a little before 8 this morning, the 1st of August. You learn later, piecing it together the way you've pieced together every important thing in this household for 9 years, that it happened quietly in the end. No great convulsion, no dramatic final scene such as you might have expected after 2 days of such visible struggle, but simply a slow ebbing, breath by breath, until the breath stopped coming at all, and nobody in the room could say with certainty which exact breath had been the last one, only that some minutes had passed since anyone had heard the next. You do not cry, not immediately. You're too tired and too disciplined by 9 years of training your face to hold still in this exact building, for tears to arrive on any schedule but their own, later private, in the narrow bed you have shared with 2 other women for so long that its shape has moulded itself to yours. What you feel in the antechamber, hearing the confirmation of a thing you already knew from the silence alone, is something closer to a physical lurch, the specific, disorienting sensation of a structure you have spent your entire adult life bracing against suddenly not being there to brace against anymore. And then, before you've had time to feel anything at all properly, the palace around you erupts into the fastest, most purposeful motion you have ever witnessed within its walls. You've imagined, in whatever vague way a wardrobe woman imagines the deaths of monarchs, that there would be a pause, some decent interval of grief and ceremony, before the machinery of government resumed its ordinary business. There is no pause. Word has reached the Privy Council, already assembled and waiting in an adjoining chamber within minutes, and you hear, through walls now rather than a single door, the sound of a great many important men moving with an urgency that has nothing to do with mourning, and everything to do with the single fact that a throne has just gone empty, and every hour it remains formally unclaimed is an hour of danger for the peaceful transfer of 3 kingdoms. The Duke of Shrewsbury, you learn before the day is out, has been handed the white staff of Lord Treasurer within the hour, on the Queen's own authority given in one of her last clear moments, precisely so that the government would have a steady hand at its centre the instant she was gone, rather than a vacuum for ambitious men to fight over. Messengers are already mounted and riding hard for the coast, carrying word to Hanover, to the elector who will become, by the time the sun sets fully on this first day of August, King George of Great Britain, though it will be weeks yet before he sets foot on English soil to claim what is already, by law, and by the swift decisive action of men who clearly spent months quietly preparing for exactly this morning, entirely his. You stand in a corridor sometime past noon, still in the same clothes you aroused in the previous dawn, and watch heralds process past toward the palace gates, and hear, faintly, from somewhere beyond the walls, the first proclamation being read aloud to a gathering crowd, the old Queen's death and the new King's accession announced in the same breath, the transition made to seem, by design, as seamless and inevitable as the turning of a season, though you alone among the crowd outside know exactly how much struggle and pain the previous several years have actually contained. It is only that evening, when the first wave of official motion has passed and the corridors have begun to empty of ministers hurrying toward other business, that you're given leave, finally, to enter the room where she died, along with Mrs. Pruitt and the small handful of other women whose task it now becomes to do the last quiet work that nobody titled or important considers beneath their dignity, to leave entirely to servants, to lay her out properly, to close what needs closing, to begin, in short, the long process of turning a queen into a body that can be shown, eventually to a nation that will want, in its own way, to see that she is truly gone. Laying her out is the hardest physical work you have ever done in this room, harder even than the worst nights with the leg, because grief and labour have never before asked so much of your body at exactly the same moment. There are 5 of you in total, and it takes every one of you working in careful, coordinated silence to manage what needs managing. You wash her gently, cloth by cloth, warm water gone cool too quickly in the basin, wringing and re-wetting it more times than you can count, working with the same unhurried patience you learned years ago for the leg, because there is no reason left to hurry, and every reason left to be gentle. Her skin beneath your hands has already begun to take on the particular cool, waxy stillness you have heard described by older women in the household who've done this work before, on lesser bodies, and you find that knowing the word for it in advance does nothing at all to prepare you for the actual sensation of it under your own palms. You dress her afterward in linen so fine it makes your own worn, laundry-cracked fingers feel clumsy against it, and it takes the full effort of all 5 of you, working in the same careful counted rhythm you once used to lift her into the wheeled chair, to arrange her properly, because a body that could not, in life, be moved without 3 strong people bracing against its weight, does not become lighter or easier to manage in death. You think, working at this task with your jaw set and your eyes carefully dry, of every single time you helped lift that same weight while she was alive to feel the indignity of being lifted, and you find some strange, private comfort in the thought that whatever else this final handling costs you, it costs her nothing at all now. the one mercy, perhaps, that death has actually delivered. The carpenters, you learn 2 days later from a wide-eyed young footman who has clearly been told more than he was meant to repeat, have run into a problem nobody quite anticipated, though anyone who ever helped lift her should have. The ordinary coffin, built to the ordinary proportions of an ordinary body, does not fit. The second one has to be built, wider than it is long enough to properly be called a coffin at all in the shape most people imagine when they hear the word. Nearly square, the footman says, lowering his voice as though the fact itself were somehow shameful, though you think privately that there is no shame in it whatsoever, only the last plain, undeniable evidence of exactly how much this woman's body suffered in the years you spent tending it. Evidence that will be sealed away inside oak and lead and never spoken of again in any account fit for a school book. It is 3 days after the death, while the household is still absorbing the shock of its own transformation. New names on new orders, new liveries already being cut for a king nobody in this palace has ever laid eyes on, that the officers of the Great Wardrobe arrive to begin the formal inventory of the late Queen's private apartments, and it is on that day that you understand exactly what she meant all those years ago about people wanting things. They come with ledgers and quills and the brisk, impersonal efficiency of men accustomed to cataloguing the contents of dead people's houses, moving through the rooms with a thoroughness that makes your stomach tighten from the moment they arrive. Every jewel case is opened and its contents recorded. Every gown is counted, folded, tagged with a small paper label, and set aside for whatever disposition the crown decides, some to be broken up for their fabric and thread. Some you gather from a murmur passed between two clerks, likely to end up as gifts distributed among favoured courtiers, a queen's whole life of clothing dispersed piece by piece into other women's closets within the year. You watch them lift out gowns you yourself, pressed and mended 100 times, gowns worn for state occasions the queen could barely stand through by the end, and you watch the clerks handle them with the flat, business-like indifference of men counting sacks of grain, and you understand, watching this, precisely why she trusted you and not them with the one thing in these rooms she actually cared about. The linen press is reached late in the afternoon by the same clerk who's been steadily working his way down the gallery shelf by shelf, and your heart begins to hammer so hard against your ribs that you are certain, for one long, breathless moment, that the sound of it must be audible across the room. Mrs. Prewitt is beside you, folding fresh sheets with hands that have gone very slightly unsteady, and you understand, without either of you saying a single word, that she too remembers exactly what sits on that shelf, though she has never once in all these years asked you what you and the Queen spoke of alone that July afternoon. The clerk opens the press. He lifts out sheet after sheet, counting aloud in a flat-bored voice, and his hand moves toward the top shelf, toward the small ebony box with the brass corners sitting exactly where it has sat for years, and you step forward before your own mind has finished deciding too, your voice coming out steadier than you have any right to expect. "Beg pardon, sir," you say, already reaching past him with the particular brisk, unhesitating confidence of a servant who has every right to be reaching exactly where she is reaching. That shelf wants proper airing before it's counted. There's damp got into the linen press this month, and half of what's up there needs turning out and drying by the fire before it spoils on your ledger. You have the box in your hands before you have fully finished the sentence. Tucked against your body beneath a fold of plain linen, you snatch from the shelf below it in the same motion, and you're already turning away, already moving toward the door with the unhurried, purposeful walk of a servant about some entirely ordinary errand. before the clerk has finished glancing up from his ledger. He does not follow you. Why would he? You are precisely what you've spent 9 years training yourself to be: invisible, unremarkable, the kind of person whose business is never anyone else's business. And it is that same careful invisibility, cultivated bandage by bandage, secret by secret, across nearly a decade of service, that lets you walk directly past 2 great wardrobe clerks and a groom of the chamber, with a dead queen's most private possession pressed against your ribs beneath a fold of ordinary linen, and not one of them thinks to give you a second glance. You do not stop walking until you are 3 floors below, in the wardrobe rooms that have been your true home for 9 years, and even there you do not stop properly until you've reached the small storage closet at the very back, where old, out-of-fashion mourning fabric is kept folded away against some future need. You set the box down on top of a bolt of black crepe and simply stand there, breathing, your whole body shaking now with an aftershock of nerve that had no room to express itself while you still needed to walk steadily. There is one more thing the clerks find that afternoon, in a different press entirely, that you learn of only second-hand from Mrs. Prewitt, whispered to you late that night when the 2 of you are finally alone, bundled at the very back of a drawer containing old, unfashionable correspondence nobody thought important enough to examine closely at first. A stack of letters, dozens of them, tied together with a faded ribbon, every one of them addressed, in a hand the clerks did not at first recognize as significant, to a name that means nothing to a stranger reading it cold off the page. Mrs. Morley to Mrs. Freeman. She had kept them, every one, through the rupture, through the cold winter audience where the Duchess demanded their return and left without them, through 3 more years of a friendship reduced to nothing but silence and formal distance. She had kept every letter the 2 of them had ever exchanged under those private girlish names, tucked away where no clerk would think to look twice, because a woman who tells the world she wants nothing more to do with a friendship of 30 years does not, apparently, find it in herself to actually burn the proof that the friendship once existed at all. The clerks record the letters in their ledger as ordinary correspondence of minor interest, to be forwarded eventually to whichever office decides such things belong to the Crown or ought to be returned to their author. Nobody in that room, filling in their neat inventory columns, understands what they have actually found. And nobody outside these walls will ever fully understand it either. Not in any account written for a history book, not in any newspaper report of the late Queen's effects. Only you and Mrs. Prewitt, and perhaps somewhere across London, the Duchess herself, who will spend the rest of her own very long life writing her own furious self-justifying account of everything that passed between them, without ever once mentioning, because she does not know it either, that the letters she demanded back and never received were never destroyed at all. They were simply kept, the way the little wooden soldier and the twist of pale hair were kept, in the one part of that woman's life that never once, in 18 years of nursing her through every indignity a failing body can produce, belonged to the state, or the ministers, or the great officers of the household, or even, in the end, to her oldest friend. It belonged, until this very night, only to her. And now, in the smallest and strangest possible way, it belongs to you. You do not sleep at all that first night, lying rigid in your narrow bed with the ebony box hidden beneath a loose floorboard you have pried up in the storage closet, a hiding place you chose because it is the one corner of this palace that belongs, in practice if not on any official plan, entirely to the wardrobe women, a place no clerk or herald has any reason to think worth searching. every creak of the old building settling in the night sounds to your overwrought ears, like a footstep coming to find you out. You spend the following days turning over, again and again, exactly what she meant by her instruction. Know what to do with your hands, even if nobody tells you what to do with your voice. You consider, briefly, carrying the box to Mrs. Masham, who loved the Queen in her own quiet, undemanding way, and who might, you think, understand better than anyone else left in this palace exactly what such an object is worth, and exactly why it must never appear in any inventory. But Mrs. Masham herself is already a woman whose position has grown precarious with the old Queen gone. New courts favour new faces, and a woman associated too closely with the last reign's private grievances is not a woman with room to spare for keeping other people's secrets safely. You consider, too, simply keeping it yourself, forever, saying nothing to anyone, letting it become the strangest and most private possession of your own eventual old age. In the end, you do neither entirely, neither. You wait 3 weeks, until the household's attention has moved fully past the inventory of the bedchamber apartments and onto the enormous, all-consuming business of preparing for a coronation nobody in England has yet met the man for. And then, on a quiet afternoon, you carry the box, wrapped again in plain linen, exactly as you carried it out, to the one person you have decided, after turning the question over more times than you can count, has both the standing and the discretion to receive it without it ever becoming anyone's official business. The late Queen's own physician, Dr. Arbuthnot, a man who tended her body for years with the same quiet, undemonstrative loyalty you tended it yourself, and who is leaving royal service now that the woman he served is gone, returning to a quieter medical practice of his own choosing. You tell him only what you must, that Her Majesty entrusted you some summers past with keeping this safe from anyone who might catalogue it, as though it were merely a piece of royal property. That you believe he is a man who will understand why it should simply disappear from any record that might otherwise be made of it, and be kept quietly by someone with no ambition left to serve and no inventory to answer to. He does not ask you how you came to remove it from a room, being formally searched by the Crown's own officers, which you take as its own kind of answer, and he takes the box from your hands with a gravity that tells you he understands exactly what it is, and exactly what it is not, and that is the last you ever see of it. Whatever became of it afterward, whether it stayed in his keeping, or passed quietly to some descendant of his own, or was eventually lost the way so many small private things are eventually lost across the slow accumulation of generations, you never learn, and in a strange way you're glad not to know, because not knowing means it stayed, at least for you, exactly what she asked it to be, something that belonged to no ledger, and no history book, and no curious stranger's later questions. Only to her, and then briefly to your own steady hands, and then to silence. The letters, by contrast, you have no power over at all, and you watch their fate unfold the way you watch everything above your own small sphere from a distance in fragments second-hand. They are eventually returned, some months later, to the Duchess of Marlborough herself, who by every account you ever hear afterward is deeply and visibly affected by their contents, when she finally reads them again in the quiet of her own vast, empty new house. 30 years of a girlhood friendship laid out in her own dead friend's careful, familiar hand. Proof, in the end, that whatever bitterness came at the very last, none of it had been strong enough to make the Queen destroy what the two of them had once meant to each other. You think, hearing this, of the flat, cold voice you overheard through a closed door in January of 1711, and you understand, finally and completely, something you have suspected for years without quite having the words for it, that people can hold two entirely true things in the same heart at once. A fury sharp enough to end 30 years of friendship in a single winter afternoon, and a tenderness deep enough to keep every letter that friendship ever produced safe from every eye but her own until the day she died. The funeral itself takes place on the 24th of August, 3 weeks after the death, and it is, by design and by the late Queen's own long-expressed wish, almost entirely without the grandeur you might expect for a monarch who ruled 3 kingdoms for 12 years. There is to be no great daylight procession through crowded streets, no long public lying in state for thousands to file past. Instead, the coffin, that strange, wide, nearly square box the carpenters built to accommodate a body no ordinary coffin could hold, is to be carried by night from Westminster to the Abbey itself, in a procession lit by torches rather than sunlight, exactly as she instructed, exactly as befits, you think, a woman who spent her whole reign trying to keep the worst of her own suffering hidden from public view, choosing even in death to be carried to her grave under cover of darkness rather than have the whole of London stand and stare at the spectacle of it. You are permitted, along with the other wardrobe women, to walk in a modest place within the funeral procession itself, some distance back from the great officers and the peers of the realm, close enough that you can hear, over the slow, muffled tread of hundreds of feet on the paved streets, the low creak of the wheels beneath the heavy funeral carriage, and the occasional soft snap and hiss of the torches burning in the warm August night air. The streets, though the hour is late, are not empty. People have come out anyway, standing silent at their windows and along the pavement edges, faces lit orange and flickering by the passing torchlight, watching without cheering, without the noise you have heard described at other great public occasions, simply watching, the way a whole city watches something ending that it does not yet fully know how to feel about, inside the Abbey itself when your own small procession finally reaches it. The air is cool and heavy with the smell of stone and old incense, and the particular dense hush of a space built specifically to make ordinary human voices feel small. You stand toward the back, near enough to see the coffin lowered, by ropes and by the careful, straining effort of the men assigned the task, into the vault beneath the floor where so many other monarchs already lie, and you think, watching it descend into darkness at last, of every single time your own hands helped lower that same weight, gently, carefully, counting under your breath, from a bed into a chair, and you find that this final lowering, though it should by every measure be the saddest of them all, brings you instead a strange, quiet mercy of a feeling, because this is the last time that body will ever need to be lifted, or turned, or carried, or managed by anyone's straining arms at all. She's simply finally at rest in a way her own body would not permit her to be at rest for the better part of a decade. You walk home in the last hours before dawn, through streets slowly emptying of their silent watchers, your feet aching in a way that has nothing to do with the leg you will never bandage again, and somewhere behind you, in the vault beneath the Abbey floor, the woman you spent 9 years of your life serving lies at last beside her husband and every one of her 17 children who came before her, all of them gathered together now in the one place where none of them finally can be taken from any of the others. The palace changes hands quickly after that, the way palaces do. King George arrives from Hanover in the middle of September, a heavy-set, cautious man of 54 who speaks almost no English, and brings with him a retinue of German attendants who eye the existing household with a wariness that runs, you soon discover, in both directions. There is no place in his court for a wardrobe woman who spent 9 years learning the particular geography of a body and a grief that belonged entirely to his predecessor, and you're not surprised, though you are quietly sorry, when Mrs. Prewitt tells you, some weeks into the new reign, that your services are to be released with a modest pension and a letter of good character, effective at the end of the month. You had expected, in some vague way you never examined too closely, to spend your whole working life inside those same 4 rooms, tending whatever body needed tending, keeping whatever secret needed keeping, until age itself made your own hands too unsteady for the work. You had not expected to be 25 years old, unmarried, and suddenly without a household at all, standing in a wardrobe gallery that no longer has any use for the particular knowledge your hands have spent 9 years accumulating. Mrs. Prewitt herself is released within the same month, older by far than you, and with no particular wish to learn the habits of a German king's household after 30 years of learning only one woman's. She goes to live with a widowed sister in Greenwich, and you visit her twice in the years that follow, finding her each time a little smaller, a little slower, sitting by a window that looks out toward the river rather than toward any palace at all, her hands finally still after a lifetime of folding. On the second visit, not long before she dies, she takes your hand in both of hers, hands gone thin and spotted now, though you would know their exact careful pressure anywhere, in any darkness, and says only, "You did well by her, Skeet. Better than most would have at your age, carrying what you carried." She does not ask what became of the ebony box, and you understand, in the particular quality of her not asking, that she has guessed most of it already and has decided, as she has decided about so many things across 30 years of discreet service, that some knowledge is safer left exactly where it lies. You do not correct the impression. You simply sit with her a while longer in the last of the afternoon light, 2 old wardrobe women who once knew the precise geography of a failing body better than either of them ever knew their own, saying nothing else about it at all. Josiah, the freckled footman who once walked you up Richmond Hill, has been asking you in his slow, patient way to marry him for the better part of 2 years by this point, and you had always put him off with some version of "not yet." There's the leg to see to this week. Not yet. Her Majesty needs the linen changed twice daily now. You no longer have that particular excuse available to you, and you find, turning the question over in the strange unmoored weeks after your release from service, that you no longer entirely want to. You marry him that November, in a small parish church not far from where his own family keeps a modest tailoring business, and within 2 years you have left royal service behind entirely, trading the wardrobe galleries of Kensington for a narrow house above a shop in a quieter corner of London, where the smell of pressed linen and starch still follows you, though now it belongs to your own household rather than a queen's, and the only leg you tend in the evenings, when your own children are small and prone to scraped knees, is theirs. You think of her often, in the years that follow, in ways that surprise you with how sharply they still arrive even decades later. You think of her whenever you press linen for your own daughters' weddings, remembering the exact particular fold Mrs. Prewitt taught you, thirds and then thirds again, a technique you have never once needed, but have also never once stopped using, because some habits outlive every practical reason for keeping them. You think of her whenever one of your own children falls gravely ill with a fever, the particular terror of watching a small body fight for breath reminding you, more sharply than you would like, of a story you once heard second-hand about a boy of 11 and a wooden soldier missing an arm. You think of her, most of all, whenever you catch sight of your own hands, grown roughened and lined now with decades of your own household's washing and mending, and remember exactly how steady they once had to be, night after night, unwrapping wet linen from a wound that would not close, learning the precise pressure that meant care rather than pain. You never speak of the ebony box, not to Josiah, not to your children, not to anyone, in all the long years that follow. It sits in the same locked room in your memory, where every other secret of that decade has sat since you first learned, at 17, exactly how much silence a servant girl's discretion is worth. You hear from time to time some fragment of news about the great figures whose lives once passed so close beside your own. The Duchess of Marlborough, living on for decades more, fierce and unforgiving to the end, outliving nearly everyone who remembered the old Queen's rooms as clearly as you remember them. The new king settling slowly and imperfectly into a country whose language he never fully learned to love. None of it touches you directly anymore. You have become, entirely and by your own choosing, an ordinary woman with an ordinary household, and the palace recedes, year by year, into something closer to a story you once heard happen to someone else, except for the particular, specific weight of an ebony box with brass corners which never quite recedes at all. You're an old woman yourself, gone properly grey, sitting by your own hearth on a winter evening some 40 years after that hot July afternoon, when a dying queen first placed a small locked box into your hands and asked you to remember, when your youngest grandchild, a curious sharp-eyed girl of perhaps 8, exactly the age you were when you first understood that some things are simply not spoken of outside a family, climbs into your lap and asks you, the way children eventually always do, what it was like, working for a real queen. You tell her some of it, the parts that are safe to tell, the parts that have long since stopped needing to be secrets. The strange wheeled chair, the great echoing rooms, the vast lonely palace where every corridor seemed to lead somewhere important, even when it only led to another corridor. You do not tell her about the leg, or the smell of a wound that would not close, or a January afternoon overheard through a closed door, or a small ebony box with brass corners handed once quietly to a departing physician on an ordinary afternoon nobody else in England will ever know occurred at all. Some things, you have decided across 4 decades of carrying them, are not made lighter by sharing. They are only made lighter, if they can be made lighter at all, by knowing that you carried them exactly the way you were asked to, all the way to the very end, without once setting the weight down where it did not belong. Your granddaughter falls asleep in your lap before you have finished the story, the way children do, her small weight going soft and heavy against your shoulder, her breath slowing into the deep, even rhythm of a body with nothing yet to carry. You sit very still, listening to the fire settle in the grate, and you think, not for the first time, that there is particular mercy in being the only person left alive who remembers a thing exactly as it happened. A mercy, and also a kind of loneliness. The two of them tangled together the way they always seem to be in the end, with anything worth remembering at all. There is one more thing you never tell your granddaughter, and never told your own husband either, though it has nothing to do with any locked box or bundle of ribboned letters. It is smaller than that, and in its own way sadder, and you have never found the words for it that felt equal to what it actually meant, watching it happen. In the weeks the clerk spent working through those rooms, cataloguing gown after gown, jewel after jewel, you watched them uncover, tucked at the backs of presses, folded into drawers nobody had opened in years, an entire second wardrobe of clothing that had simply never been worn at all. Silk stockings still bundled in their original paper, dozens of pairs, ordered in better years when a woman still hoped to dance again, or at least to stand long enough at a window to be seen in them. Gloves by the gross kid leather, soft as a held breath, never once drawn over hands too swollen in the end to fit into anything so fine. A pale blue gown, cut in a fashion already 3 or 4 years out of date by the time of her death, its bodice never laced, its hem never once brushed against a floor. Ordered, you gathered from a note pinned to its sleeve in Mrs. Prewitt's own hand years earlier, for a birthday that had arrived and passed with the Queen too unwell to leave her rooms at all. You think of that gown more often, in your own long life, than you think of almost anything else from those 9 years, more even than the ebony box, though the box carried the greater secret. There is something about an entire silk gown, cut and finished and never worn, hanging year after year in a dark press behind heavier, more practical clothing, that says everything about the particular shape of her suffering that no medical account, no ledger entry, no solemn funeral oration ever quite managed to say. She'd gone on hoping in some small, stubborn corner of herself to need that gown. She had gone on ordering the world as though her body might yet surprise everyone and recover its old capacity for an evening's dancing, right up until the ordering itself became one more quiet, private fiction nobody around her had the heart to correct. This, you have come to believe across the long, slow accumulation of your own later years, is the truest thing that was ever found in those rooms, truer even than a locked box of a dead child soldier, or 30 years of letters nobody was meant to see. Not a scandal, not a great confession, only the plain, unglamorous evidence of a woman who kept hoping for an ordinary life she was never in the end permitted to have, kept ordering the gloves, kept having the gown cut, kept a small wooden soldier close enough to touch on the days the grief became too heavy to carry alone, and who managed, through all of it, to keep enough of that hope hidden from public view that history remembers her mostly as a stout, unremarkable queen who happened to reign during a war and a union, and very little else worth the schoolboy's attention. You know better. You knew better from the moment you first knelt at her feet at 17 years old, with your sleeves rolled to the elbow, and you know it still. An old woman by her own fire, the last living person who ever truly understood the exact weight of everything that Palace tried, and mostly failed, to keep entirely to itself. The city goes on, the way cities always do, indifferent to any single life that passed through it, however grand the title that life once carried. Kensington Palace stands through the reigns that come after. The German king who never learned to love the language of the country he ruled, and his son after him, and all the crowded, complicated centuries still waiting beyond the edge of your own lifetime. Centuries you will never see and cannot imagine, though you sometimes try, sitting by your fire with your grandchild's warm weight, asleep against your shoulder, to picture the rooms you once knew so intimately standing empty now, or full of entirely different lives, entirely different griefs, none of them remembering the particular smell of lavender water over a wound that would not close. The river you once watched from the top of Richmond Hill still curls the same silver loop through the same patchwork fields, though the barges on it now carry different cargoes to different markets, and the girl who stood there once with her hair pulling loose from its cap, breathless from the climb, catching her first full view of the small, contained world she had spent years serving from the inside, that girl is nowhere left to find except in the memory of the old woman who was once entirely briefly only that. Some things do not change, even as everything around them does. A body still fails the way bodies have always failed, slowly, unglamorously, one small indignity compounding the last. A friendship still breaks, sometimes, under the exact same weight that once held it together, love curdling into control until neither party can quite remember which came first. A mother still keeps some small worn thing belonging to a child she buried, tucked away where no ledger will ever record it, because grief, in the end, does not care what rank a person holds, or what crown they are permitted to wear, or how many kingdoms bend at the waist when they enter a room. Grief asks the same plain, private, unglamorous things of a queen that it asks of a linen draper's daughter from Norwich, and it is answered, in both cases, the same plain, private, unglamorous way, with a locked box kept close and a silence nobody outside four walls was ever meant to hear broken. The fire has burned low by the time you finally rise, careful and slow with your own old joints, to carry your sleeping grandchild up to her bed. Your knees complain on the stairs the way they have complained for years now. A dull, familiar ache that has nothing dramatic about it at all. Only the ordinary tax old age collects from a body that spent its youth kneeling on hard floors for hours at a stretch, bandage after bandage, night after night, in service to someone else's suffering. You lay the girl down, draw the blanket to her chin, and stand a moment in the doorway watching her breathe, slow and even and entirely untroubled, the way only the very young and the very well can breathe. You think, watching her, of every child you ever tended in that other life, the small coat, the wooden soldier, the 4 infants who did not live long enough to need either. You think of your own children, grown now and scattered into households of their own, each one carrying some small piece of the discipline you learned at 17 without ever quite knowing where you learned it. And you think, one last time before you let the thought go for the evening, of the woman who taught you, more thoroughly than any other person in your life, exactly how much a body can endure, and exactly how little of that endurance the rest of the world is ever permitted to see. You go back down to your own small parlour, banking the fire properly for the night, checking the shutters out of the same old habit that once had you checking a linen press shelf without meaning to. An anxious little ritual your hands still perform decades after the thing they were guarding ever needed guarding at all. The house settles around you the way houses do at this hour. Small creaks and shifts in old timber, the particular hush of a street gone quiet outside your window. No coaches now, no watchman's call, only the ordinary dark of an ordinary night in an ordinary life you chose, in the end, over every grand thing that other life might once have offered you. You are tired in the good, clean way of a day properly spent, not the bone-deep exhaustion of 9 years bent over someone else's failing body, but the softer tiredness of a woman who raised children and buried a husband and told a granddaughter half a true story by firelight, and found, in the telling, that some old weight had shifted just slightly, just enough, without ever fully setting itself down. You climb the stairs to your own bed slowly, one hand trailing the wall for balance, and you think, as you often do at this hour, of the girl you once were, 17, cracked hands, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sick with fright the first time she saw what greatness actually looked like beneath its silk and velvet. That girl is still in you somewhere, the way the boy from Norwich never fully left, the way every young, frightened, capable self a person has ever been stays folded somewhere inside the older self that eventually replaces it, the way a queen's small, buried grief never fully left her either, however many decades of state occasions were piled on top to hide it. Candles gutter low in houses up and down every street in London tonight, the way they always have, the way they always will, in one form of light or another, long after every name in this story has faded from anyone's living memory. Somewhere across the city, in rooms grander than yours will ever be, other servants attending other bodies through other private sufferings, nobody outside four walls will ever fully know, keeping other secrets exactly as carefully as you once kept yours, because this, in the end, is the oldest and steadiest work there is, the quiet, unglamorous labour of one person, holding still and holding faithful beside another person's pain, asking nothing, expecting no credit, simply staying, hour after hour, until the staying is no longer needed. Centuries will pass, though you will not live to see even the first small handful of them. The palace you once knew so intimately will stand through wars and fashions and monarchs you cannot imagine, its long galleries walked by people who will never once think of a wardrobe woman named Deborah Skeet, who will not know her name existed at all, who will visit the gardens and the staterooms and perhaps, on some quiet weekday afternoon centuries from now, stand exactly where you once stood and gaze out toward exactly the same stretch of London sky, without any notion of the particular grief and labour and quiet devotion that once moved through the rooms just above their heads. The gowns will be gone by then, cut apart or lost or crumbled to nothing in some forgotten trunk. The letters will have long since been read, catalogued, argued over by scholars who never knew either woman's actual voice. The ebony box, wherever it finally came to rest, however many hands it passed through after Dr. Arbuthnot's, will very likely be gone too, one more small object dissolved back into the vast silent tide of things that do not survive the centuries however carefully they were once guarded. But some things do not need to survive in that particular way to have mattered. The steadiness of a young woman's hands, learned bandage by bandage until it became simply who she was. The mercy of a friend who asks nothing in return, arriving at exactly the moment a duchess's love has curdled into something too heavy to bear any longer. The particular private tenderness of a mother who cannot let go of a small wooden soldier, however many crowns and kingdoms rest upon the same tired shoulders that once rocked that child to sleep. These things do not need a ledger entry or a scholar's footnote or even a name remembered 300 years later to have been entirely, fiercely real while they lasted. They only needed for their brief span someone steady enough to witness them and carry them faithfully to whatever quiet ending they were owed. You are that someone tonight, one last time, lying in your own bed in your own ordinary house, the candle on your own window-sill guttering down toward its final inch of wax. You feel the day's walking settle into your legs, pleasant and heavy, the way it always has since you were young enough to climb a whole hill on a Sunday afternoon, just to see a view nobody had told you to go looking for. Your mind, usually so busy accounting for tomorrow's small household tasks, goes quiet in the particular way it only goes quiet at the very end of a long, full day. The chatter of ordinary living fading into something closer to peace. Let it come then, the way it always comes, the way it came for a queen who fought 2 days for every breath before finally letting the last one go unremarked, the way it will come, eventually, for every person reading or listening to this story wherever and whenever they happen to be. Let the noise of the day fade. Let the old griefs settle back onto their shelf, folded away where they belong, not forgotten, only finally, mercifully, at rest. Let your own thoughts slow and soften and finally stop, the way a candle's flame narrows and dims and goes out all at once, leaving only the dark and the quiet and the small, steady comfort of knowing that you carried today whatever weight was actually yours to carry, and set none of it down where it did not belong. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. You have done across a long life exactly as much good as one pair of steady hands can reasonably be asked to do, and that, in the end, on any ordinary night in any ordinary bed, is enough. The candle on the windowsill gutters and dims and goes out. Somewhere far below, a church bell marks an hour you're already too far gone into sleep to count. And then nothing. Just rest. Just the long, slow drift into whatever dreams may still be waiting for a woman who spent her whole youth keeping other people's secrets and finally, at the very end of a long and quiet life, allowed herself to lay just one of them down. Good night.